Hey, how's it going everyone? I'm White Pointer and it's time again to dig into the questions you have left in the comments of my previous videos to answer your long-standing mysteries about how classic games manage to create their graphical tricks. What astonishing effects are we going to uncover this time? I hope you're ready, so buckle in for the ride, and as usual, why not try to guess what's going on before the answer is revealed? Let's do it! The first question comes from Raposa Cadella, who says they would love to know how the split screen for the two-player mode in Skull and Crossbones for the NES worked. Let's venture out to find the buried treasure within this game. Please don't make me walk the plank for these terrible puns. So Skull and Crossbones was made by Tengen, or Tengen. I'm actually not entirely sure how that's supposed to be pronounced, but I'm gonna roll with Tengen. If you know your video game history, you'll know they had a rather interesting story. They were a label created by Atari Games that came about for a number of reasons that I'm not going to elaborate on in this video, but they were famous, or rather infamous, for bypassing Nintendo's lockout chip on the NES and releasing unlicensed games which had black cartridges, and Skull and Crossbones was one of these. They did this by reverse engineering the lockout chip, but they needed to resort to even shadier behaviour to access the chip's code. They went to the Copyright Office under the story that they were planning on pursuing legal action against Nintendo and wanted to see the chip's documentation. And with that in hand, they created their own lockout chip bypass that they called the Rabbit. The irony is, most of Tengen's unlicensed games were actually pretty good. There is a point to telling you this which will become clearer soon. Skull and Crossbones can be played in two-player co-op by simply pressing start on the second controller at any time. And in what was pretty rare to see on consoles at the time, it actually uses a split screen mode, with two independently scrolling halves. The Nintendo Entertainment System didn't have a built-in scanline counter that would normally make this sort of thing possible, so how did they manage to make it do this? It needed a helper chip called a memory mapper. There were actually a lot of memory mapper chips for the original NES, or NES, officially called multi-memory controllers or memory management controllers, abbreviated to MMC. Many of these were manufactured by Nintendo themselves, and there were also a bunch of third-party chips, some of which were based off the designs of the Nintendo chips. The main purpose of these was to allow for bank switching in order to produce larger games, but over time, they gained other functionality too, including supporting battery-backed saves and scanline counters. Tengen created their own version of Nintendo's MMC3 chip with some extra features that they called the Rambo 1 chip, which actually also had the Rabbit lockout bypass integrated into it too. It was used in this game as well as a number of their other games. This Rambo 1 chip, of course, had a scanline counter, and this is what's being used to create the multiple screen segments. There's actually three distinct segments of the screen here: Player 1 in the top section, Player 2 in the bottom section, but also the HUD in the middle section. The bottom section is using the same tile map as the top section, just scrolling it from a different position, which is pretty standard. The middle portion though is actually on its own completely separate tile map, so the game is drawing the top portion, swapping out the tile map to draw the middle portion, then swapping the first tile map back in again to draw the bottom portion. You can tell they were trying to be cognizant of the sprite limit, because only the shoes of the other player are drawn on each screen, not the whole sprite. In order to give the system enough time to do this swapping, which includes the sprites by the way, you'll notice there are black bars between each split where nothing is drawn to screen. 14 blank scanlines at the top, then 7 blank scanlines between each of the other sections, and the first column of tiles on the left of the screen are also blank. It still doesn't do the transitions completely cleanly though, as if you look closely, you can see some graphical artifacts in some places, but all things considered, this is a pretty impressive achievement, especially for an unlicensed game. Tengen did actually end up filing a lawsuit against Nintendo, claiming they were creating a monopoly, but Nintendo countersued them for breach of contract and eventually won, which led to all of Tengen's games being removed from store shelves. There was a particularly big disagreement around Tengen's unlicensed version of Tetris, because Atari had the arcade rights to the game, but Nintendo had the home console rights to it, and Nintendo won that case too. The label was ultimately shut down in 1994. Moving on to the Mega Drive, Nate RD90 asks, can I look at the tornado in the background of Vectorman 2's level Shout and Twist? This one's been sitting in my backlog for a while, so sorry it's taken me this long to get to it, but now it's time. So let's take the game for a spin and see how this is done. The Vectorman games are sometimes considered the Mega Drive's answer to Donkey Kong Country, given that they use the same kind of 3D rendering techniques. Although given the console's lack of colours compared to the Super Nintendo, they don't look quite as vibrant as those games do. They do still pull off some nifty tricks regardless though, and also make good use of the hardware. I've previously talked about Vectorman's use of shadow in the highlight mode in my video that covered that subject, but this question is about this specific effect in Vectorman 2. In this level, there's a tornado in the background, and the gimmick of the level is that you are constantly being pushed to the left as you are apparently being blown by the wind. The comment is specifically asking about how that tornado is done, so if we isolate the relevant plane, we can see it looks like this, with the animated wind effect, which is done using palette swaps. There's also a darker triangle in the middle of the tile map that's also doing palette swaps, which is what makes the tornado shape. The warping effect we can see is done by slowly scrolling this background left and right, while at the same time using individual line scrolling to create a wave effect. Combining these two techniques together is what creates the effect we see in the final game. This kind of trick was pretty common in the 4th console generation. There's quite a lot of games that do this kind of thing, but it doesn't make it any less impressive, and the developers behind this game, Blue Sky Software, definitely had a good grasp of Sega's hardware, and were also behind games like the Mega Drive versions of Jurassic Park and Shadowrun. Staying with the Mega Drive, poor little Jeffy says that Red Zone is practically a tech demo, and they are curious about the rotation in the helicopter segments. The background rotates in a way reminiscent of Contra 3's overhead stages, but this has tall objects with a depth effect. Well, I would have a go at answering this, but John Burton over at the Coding Secrets channel has already done a video explaining how this effect works, and explains it much better than I could, so I'll leave a link in the description where you can check his video out. Chiropoulos has also covered this in a past video from a slightly different angle, and I'll leave a link to his video too, so I don't think I'll be adding anything of value. I don't want to just drop links and leave it at that, so instead I want to focus on what the question says about the opening screen boasting various effects. Specifically, I'll cover something which neither of those guys did and talk about how they pulled off the full screen video that's used for the intro. So let's get to the chopper and figure this out. Red Zone was developed by Zyrinx and features a couple of different play modes, including these levels where you pilot a helicopter, which is what the question was mostly asking about, and also levels where you need to traverse on foot. But as I said, these have already been covered by other videos, so I'm going to zero in on how they did this really impressive looking FMV intro. Before we go any further though, before you ask, yes, this is actually a genuine FMV, albeit heavily compressed, but an FMV nonetheless. It's been deliberately stylized like this to mask the compression, and you'll notice the other thing they've done here is that there's just 7 colours. Black, grey and 5 shades of red, meaning it's a limited form of a 3-bit palette. It swaps for a yellow palette for the text and the flashes between shots, which I suspect are actually separate videos, but it's still only using the same number of colours at once. If they used any more colours than this, it would have increased the file size of the video. That's not even the most interesting part though. As we know, the Mega Drive, like most consoles at the time, was tile-based, so how did they convert this video to use tiles to work within the limitations of the hardware? It's actually really clever. Firstly, that background with the different shades of red isn't actually a background at all, believe it or not. That's on the sprite layer and composed entirely of sprite tiles. The black and grey that make up the actual moving image on top of those red sprite tiles are on the background planes, but you can't actually see it normally by isolating the planes like this. We need to turn on transparent pixels, and there it is. We've seen something similar to this in a previous video, when we were examining how James Pond 3 did Star Wars-like scrolling text, but in that example, the transparent pixels were basically cutting holes in the black background to form the letters, because they wanted the letters to use the colours behind them. What Red Zone is doing here is the opposite. It's not cutting out the shapes using transparent pixels, it's cutting out everything around the shapes using transparent pixels. You'll also notice here that there's some separate tiles used to form the outlines of the shapes, which are used to smooth the edges out. The image is on both plane A and plane B, and there is a reason for that. It's because one of them is being used as a kind of frame buffer and is one frame behind the other. So the game switches between displaying plane A or plane B each frame, while the tiles are updated on the other plane in the background. This isn't something I even spotted until I recorded this footage and I went through it frame by frame. This allows it to run at around 30 frames a second, so it's a pretty remarkable technical achievement all around. On the subject of cutscenes, Ghosty85 and Chauncey Gardner want to know how the cutscenes worked in the console versions of Flashback, also known as Flashback: The Quest for Identity, as they were cartridge-based in comparison to the computer versions. In fact, the game was marketed as a CD-ROM game on a cartridge, so how on earth did they manage to do that? Let's flash back to the past and take a look. So Flashback was one of those games we refer to now as cinematic platformers, and it took the cinematic part to the next level with some spectacular looking fully animated cutscenes. It was originally programmed for the Mega Drive and then ported to many other platforms, although oddly the Amiga version released first. It's noted for featuring hand-drawn environments and fully manually rotoscoped animations, and France-based developer Delphine Software created their own compression technology in order to accommodate it all. This is actually the reason why the game is restricted to using a single screen at a time and doesn't scroll. They needed to use a lot of the CPU to decompress the animation frames while keeping the backgrounds highly detailed, and didn't have enough horsepower left to have smooth scrolling. So this wasn't really a design, art or gameplay decision, it was a technical one. Anyway, the questions are asking specifically about these cutscenes you see throughout the game, and there's actually quite a few of them, even if many of them are only a few seconds long. As you can see, well, there really isn't anything else quite like them on cartridge-based consoles from this period, and it's all happening in real time. The way the console is drawing these to screen is pretty clever too. The cutscene is drawn just using the Mega Drive's two background layers. One of them, plane B, is actually more or less completely static and doesn't move, apart from doing some palette swaps in some scenes. Plane A, on the other hand, is acting almost like a sprite layer, as this is where all the animation happens and where all the moving objects are. Using this approach, the console only needs to animate one layer. This is the same approach used on the Super Nintendo version too. It's running in mode 1, but it's only using two background layers. The third one is just blank and unused, which does make me wonder a little why they didn't use mode 2 instead. The foreground layer uses one color palette, and the background layer uses another color palette. The animation itself is done by changing each tile dynamically on this foreground layer. They are stored in VRAM exactly how they appear on screen, which is actually pretty unusual in most cases, but here it makes sense. By changing the colors of the pixels in each tile on the fly, the animations can be created. It's also working with a kind of pseudo frame buffer, updating the image in a couple of passes in the background before the complete frame is drawn to screen. To increase performance, there's letterboxing going on, with the top and bottom 47 scan lines not being used. To gain some further insight, I actually reached out to the game's director and also one of its programmers, Paul Cousset, who was totally awesome and gave me some of his time. He explained to me that the animations in the cutscenes were all drawn with vectors, so they actually took very little space on the cartridge. The trade-off though is that these consoles weren't really designed to render real-time vector graphics, so they were not particularly fast at drawing them to the screen. The Mega Drive manages this okay. The frame rate isn't stable by any means and fluctuates depending on how much is happening on screen and how big the vectors are. In some places it updates it as quickly as every 2 or 3 frames, and in other places slowing down to every 9 or 10 frames or more, but these extreme drops are pretty rare. The Super Nintendo fares worse at this, updating the image once every 7 or 8 frames as a minimum, and at the extreme other end, sometimes taking 20 frames or more. This one pretty much can be blamed solely on the CPU speed of the SNES just struggling to draw the vectors quick enough, because it's actually already using fast ROM and running at its maximum speed. Note this is only how the Mega Drive and Super Nintendo versions worked. The Atari Jaguar was different, as that was not tile-based and used a blitter, and the computer versions on Amiga and MS-DOS also worked differently, but they are outside the scope of this video. The CD versions actually completely replaced these real-time vector-based cutscenes with pre-rendered 3D animated videos, which are also fully voice-acted. In my opinion anyway, these don't fit the style of the game and make it lose some of its charm. What's actually pretty interesting is that the maximum ROM size for the Mega Drive at the time was 16 megabits, which wasn't enough space for the game, so the developers behind it reverse engineered their own 24 megabit cartridge. They did this without telling Sega though, and when they later showed it to them, Sega weren't entirely happy but allowed them to go ahead with it. Despite that, they still needed to make some cuts, like some enemies, to get it all on there. Sega would, of course, later manufacture their own 24 and eventually 32 megabit ROM sizes. I'll leave a link in the description for an interview with Paul Casey on the Stay Forever podcast that goes into more detail about the making of Flashback. Thanks once again to Paul for taking the time to help us solve this mystery. Alright, moving on to the Super Nintendo, this is another question that's taken me a while to get to, so my apologies for that, but it comes from Yukator, who simply asks, please do Killer Instinct's 3D floor effects. I've also had a number of other questions about this trick in other games, such as this one from Remen F, who asks about it in regards to the game Deadly Moves on the Mega Drive, which was also available on the Super Nintendo under the name Power Moves. This will answer those questions too. My instincts tell me we are gonna uncover this killer mystery. I imagine most of you know about Killer Instinct, originally released on powerful arcade hardware and intended to also be released on the Nintendo 64, or Ultra 64 as it was known by at the time, but instead was ported to the Super Nintendo when the N64 was delayed. Despite the obvious hardware limitations, it's a really impressive and remarkable port. It remains faithful to the arcade original and is only really missing some of the bells and whistles, like FMV cutscenes, some fancy effects and camera angles, and some animation frames. But other than that, the whole game is here and plays extremely well, and even fixes some of the bugs present in the arcade version. The question is referring to the kind of 3D effect you'll see on the floors on many of the stages in the game. As you move left and right, you can see the angle of it changing. Many of you might instantly recognize what this is. It's achieved with the individual line scroll. Each scanline that makes up the floor is scrolling left or right at a slightly faster rate to the scanline directly above it, and this is what gives the floor that illusion of depth. In some stages, the floor is on its own separate layer, and in other stages it's not, but it doesn't really matter either way, because it's line scrolling making the effect happen, and the top portion scrolls independently of the floor. This should hopefully visualize it better. Starting from the center position, as the background scrolls to one side, the scanlines on the floor all scroll separately, with each scanline scrolling a little faster and further than the one directly above it. It's essentially a very specific form of parallax scrolling. In this particular case, the last scanline ends up horizontally offset by 61 pixels compared to where the floor starts, and all the rest between them are incrementally staggered. Combined with the specifically designed background artwork, this creates a 3D looking depth effect. If you haven't heard of Deadly Moves or Power Moves, I wouldn't blame you, because it's a pretty average and forgettable fighting game from the early 90s, with some weird controls that are more like a beat 'em up than a fighting game. It's not a particularly noteworthy game, but it does show that both consoles were equally as capable of pulling off this effect. This next question is from Pocket PK6912, who says, something they'd love to see in one of these videos is the Stage 2 background in Pop and Twinbee. They know it's likely just a combination of raster effects and colour maths, but it still honestly looks so cool. The boss also has some kind of weird colour blending going on with it, and I'd love to know what causes that too. Let's pop in to see what's happening here. Pop and Twinbee was a vertical shooter made by Konami that was one of those rare cases of a game that was released in Japan and PAL regions, but never in North America, at least not until it appeared on the Switch Online service. This one will be a fairly quick answer, because there actually isn't anything unusual going on in this level. The warping effect you can see to make it look like the level is underwater is just done with HDMI interrupts to create a line scrolling raster effect, in the same way many other games do their underwater levels, and in an almost identical way to what we saw Vectorman 2 doing with the tornado on the Mega Drive earlier. The colour matte circuit isn't being used here at all. The lower layer is darker because that's simply how the artwork in the tile map is designed. That is, until you get to the boss. Now here we do see a transparency effect that's created with colour mattes. The boss is actually on a background layer here and is placed onto the subscreen, while everything else is on the main screen. Colour addition is then applied between them to make the boss translucent. Its glowing eyes are actually sprites, with no transparency effect on them. About halfway through the fight, it opens up and the transparency effect is turned off. Most other games don't toggle between having it off and on in the same scene like this, but there was really nothing stopping developers doing it, and this is a pretty good demonstration of how quickly it can happen. We move from a vertical shooter to a horizontal one, with the next question that was posted from Saviour Gabriel, who says that one thing they have been curious about is how the rotating column was done near the end of the first stage of R-Type 3. I've been wanting to talk about this effect for a while actually, so I'm glad someone's asking about it. Let's look at this one from all angles to figure out what's going on. R-Type 3 is a really impressive game for the Super Nintendo, showcasing lots of various visual effects, and doesn't suffer from quite as much slowdown as the previous games in the franchise either. I've answered a question about this game in the very first video I did in this series, but I was asking about a boss fight, whereas this question is asking about this rotating hexagonal prism we see towards the end of the game's first level. It's a really cool looking 3D effect they've managed to achieve here, so how did they do it? Firstly, it may not look like it, but there is actually a screen split here. Multiple screen splits actually, but it's showing Mode 7 in all segments. The Mode 7 tile map consists of a narrow strip of tiles, just 8 tiles high, that's drawn to the screen up to 3 times, one on top of the other, and this is what makes up the prism. This part of the Mode 7 tile map is constantly scrolling downwards, while affine transformations are applied to scale it larger for the lower segment as it's coming to view, or scale it smaller for the upper segment as it's disappearing from view. In addition to that, HDMA effects are being applied on specific scan lines to darken the lower segment or brighten the upper segment to apply a shadow effect and give the rotating object more of a sense of depth. There's also a lot of black space on the tile map, which is where the game points to in the segments that need to show the black background of space behind it. Those other pieces you can see on the tile map are just parts of the previous section of the level and are not used here. You'll notice that the column doesn't stay in place either, it shifts vertically too, slowly moving up then down, so the scan lines where the splits happen to redraw the relevant part of the Mode 7 tile map are constantly changing as the game is in motion. To sell the illusion further, some clever manipulation of the priorities of the enemy sprites makes it look like they are appearing from behind it. They are initially set to the lowest priority, priority 0, as they fly upwards to reveal themselves, before switching to priority 2 just as they begin descending so they appear in front of the column when they get low enough. Finally, we have a reasonably recent question from Astera2 about Contra 3, but it makes sense to include it in this video since it's about the split screen function, and earlier I covered how Skull and Crossbones on the original NES did it, so now it's time to see how the SNES does it. The comment says that they'd like an explanation for Contra 3's top-down levels, since in 2-player mode, they appear to be making use of dual Mode 7, even though there isn't an extra chip like Mario Kart had. I've talked about a couple of Contra 3's effects in previous videos, but not this one specifically, so let's split this down the middle to open it up and see what's inside. The first thing I need to clarify before I go any further is that Super Mario Kart's split screen doesn't have anything to do with the extra chip inside the cartridge. Super Mario Kart uses the DSP-1 chip, which in this case is used to assist with 3D positioning calculations, likely to help to compute how the various items you can throw interact with the races and the track. The screen split is being done entirely on base hardware, and a number of other games that don't use any enhancement chips also do this, including Street Racer, Battle Cars, and of course Contra 3. So how's it done? It's all done with mode swaps on scanline interrupts. As I've explained on a number of occasions previously, the Super Nintendo had the ability to split the screen on any specified scanline and display an alternative background in each segment. Much of the time it was used to display entirely different modes. For example, F-Zero uses Mode 1 in the top section for the skyline and Mode 7 in the bottom section for the track. But they don't necessarily need to be different background modes, they can also be the same background modes, including Mode 7. Only one Mode 7 tile map could be loaded into memory at once, so it couldn't display different Mode 7 backgrounds, but it could display different locations on the same Mode 7 background, which is exactly how Contra 3 is using it. The screen is split several times to display Mode 7 at the top until scanline 104, Mode 1 in the middle from scanlines 105 to 120 for the HUD information, and Mode 7 again at the bottom from scanline 121 to the end of the screen. It needs a few scanlines to recompute the positioning of the sprites in each segment, which is why there's a small black bar at the top of the screen, and also why they probably chose to put the HUD information in the middle. Unlike the NES, no enhancement chips are required to do this on the SNES, it's a function that's built into the hardware. If you want to see more examples of games that made really creative use of Mode 7 and being able to split the screen multiple times like this, you should definitely check out this video, where I break down how a number of different effects worked. However, I will say that Street Racer that I mentioned earlier gets an extra special prize. It takes it to the next level by not just supporting 2-player split screen, but if you have a multi-tap, up to 4-player split screen, which is pretty insane, and I can't think of another game from this generation that does this. Another video down and more of your questions answered. Thank you so much for your continued support. It never ceases to amaze me how ingenious developers were back then to get around technical limitations of these old consoles to seemingly achieve the impossible, from split screens to 3D effects to full motion video. Here's a bonus bit of trivia for those of you who've made it to the end. The line scroll effect I described on the floors in Killer Instinct has been around in fighting games for longer than you might have realised. In fact, it was used in Street Fighter II: The World Warrior way back in 1991. It's pretty noticeable in stages like Ryu stage on the wooden floorboards, or Dhalsim stage, especially if you observe the rug on the floor. Had you ever noticed that before? I did a bit of research to see if I could find any games prior to this that used the technique, and the arcade version of Pit Fighter from 1990 does seem to do it. It's difficult to tell and it's quite subtle, but it does appear to be there. These are the earliest examples I could find of this being used in fighting games, but if you can think of any cases that predate these, let me know in the comments. And now that you've seen this trick in fighting games, maybe you can think of games in other genres that also use it. Give me a thumbs up if you liked this video, it really helps a lot, and don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with my content. Thanks for watching and see you next time.